Welcome to INKOnversation, the podcast that fuels your entrepreneurial spirit, brought to you by INKOmoko. We deliver thought-provoking conversations with industry leaders, game changers, and unsung heroes, all making an impact in your communities and shaping the future of business. Let's grow together and transform the world, one business at a time.
Hello, Jessica. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you today. My name is Kampeta Sayinzoga. I'm the CEO of the Development Bank of Rwanda, and I'm really delighted to have you for this opportunity to have this podcast. So you've had an interesting career and very successful career in finance in many ways. Today, you are currently on the board of Goldman Sachs, and you've been listed several times on Forbes as part of the most powerful women. For 5 years, you were the CFO of Shell, but you've had a very, very successful career in Shell in very different finance positions. And as we know, it's one of the largest companies in Europe. So starting at the beginning, how did you think about combining finance and energy? And why energy?
So it's lovely to be having this conversation with you, Kampeta. I am in energy and have been in energy for over 20 years. And what drew me to energy and has kept me in energy is the role that it plays in economic development and improving the quality of lives around the world. And from a very early age, I had the ambition and desire to work in an area that had the potential to have a positive and meaningful impact on the world. And I found that in energy. And I also wanted to kind of work on a global scale. I was interested in global prosperity, global opportunity, and energy clearly is relevant in every country and every community around the globe. In terms of finance is something that I discovered about mid-career. I liked the kind of analytical piece of it, the kind of quantitative piece of it, and trying to understand the world and make decisions based on kind of what is the right answer, if you will, or the way to create value in the world, which I think is an important piece of defining and creating positive solutions in the world. If you can make it work in the business sector, if you can create value in the business sector, you're more likely creating something that's ultimately sustainable. So that relationship to business, finance, and determining how to move forward in an organization, that really worked for me in terms of just a way of thinking about things. And people seem to think I did okay with that field as well.
You've done amazingly well. You didn't do just okay. But it's interesting that now that you've left Shell, which is known, of course, as an oil and gas company. Currently you're on the executive committee of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, also on the board of General Electric. One thing that both have in common is really the drive and the focus on a net zero emission future. Do you see this as like a natural continuation of your oil and gas career, or do you see this as kind of a new departure and new area of focus?
For me, it's absolutely a continuation of how I came into the energy industry and the impact I've sought to have. The energy sector is important not only in terms of its impact on economic development and prosperity, but it is one of the most kind of challenging areas because energy needs to be brought to the world in a way that's abundant, that it's available to everybody, that there's kind of equitable access to energy. It needs to be affordable. People need to be able to have energy in their lives to prosper. And as importantly, it needs to be environmentally sustainable. And trying to achieve all three of those things with our energy system is very challenging. And the nature of that challenge has also been fascinating to me. Another reason why I've been drawn to the sector and why I've chosen to work in the sector for decades. Achieving environmentally positive outcomes while providing abundant, affordable energy to the world is absolutely what I've been trying to achieve throughout my career. And very much in the context of Shell, it's primarily an oil and gas company. Oil and gas is 80% of the energy that the world consumes today, and that contributes to the well-being of many on the planet, although we still have 1 billion people on the planet who do not have access to energy. And that's something that we need to address as quickly as possible.
Very interesting. Recently I was in Washington for the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, and the conversation around the energy transition was very much at the center of what was being discussed globally. And for countries like Rwanda that have been impacted by climate change and have development challenges in terms of access to electricity, it's a very interesting conversation to see how the transition will happen. Do you think that this transition towards a clean energy may slow down access to electricity in some of the poorer countries because of all the challenges, which are not easy challenges to address in contexts that sometimes have not so good governance and poor policy frameworks. Do you think that moving from oil and gas to cleaner technologies, this may slow down the rate of access to electricity in some countries, or not really?
And Peter, I don't see why that would necessarily be the case, because those sectors are capital intensive. So the capital intensity of the renewable energy industry versus the capital intensity of, the traditional oil and gas is quite capital intensive. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's the case. And of course, one of the beauties of the renewable energy system is that once you do the capital investment, you of course no longer need to be, say, importing fuels and getting ongoing exposure to global energy markets in terms of the price being paid by local citizens, which has been a very much an issue over the last couple of years. So I think resiliency and sustainability benefits from an economic perspective that renewable energy can provide. There could be some nuances around incumbents and capacity. So there might be more capacity with the traditional oil and gas system than there is, let's say, with the relatively newer industries around renewable energy. And you might not have that same capacity perhaps in some of these countries. But generally speaking, wind and solar is relatively low tech. It doesn't take a huge amount of sophistication to build those projects. I hope I'm not offending anybody, but they're not that tricky to install solar panels and hook them up to a grid and hook them up to a house. So I'm optimistic. For me, it's about the leadership challenge, the governance challenge, focusing capital in these markets. I think these are problems that can be overcome, but it does require leadership. It does require courage and the conviction of local players in terms of ensuring that the governance is right and in place. If we get the governance right, I think we can really enable a lot more capital to flow.
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, the bank that I lead, BRD, has been helping in terms of connecting poor households to solar panels at the household level. And the experience that you're describing is exactly what we've discovered, is actually the technical capacity to make it happen. The technical requirements are fairly manageable, even in a context of lower skills. So it's a very hopeful future from that point of view. I totally agree with you. From a Rwanda kind of grassroots perspective,
I'd love to see your work at some time. That sounds really great.
Please do. We would love to have you around. I'll steer the conversation to another topic that is also, I think, relatable in terms of challenges that you may find in your part of the world and our part of the world, which is access to some of the positions that you've had for women more generally. So even in a country like Rwanda, Rwanda is standing very tall when it comes to gender empowerment. I think we have one of the best statistics when it comes to gender inclusion and gender empowerment. But even in the context of Rwanda, that's very progressive. We have very few female CFOs. And I think globally, there's also very few women at executive level in the energy sector, which is known to be, a male-dominated environment. So you were listed as being the fifth woman to be elected also on Goldman Sachs group board. So you seem to be consistently breaking glass ceilings left, right, and center. And I can't help but really ask you, did this take a toll on you as you're growing your career in a male-dominated space? If you can tell us a little bit more about that.
I smile a bit when people say that the oil and gas sector is male-dominated, because I kind of say, well, which sector isn't male-dominated? But generally speaking, I've spent a huge amount of my life in rooms where, I was maybe one or maybe, less than 20% of the people in the room were my gender. I think I don't have an easy answer for this. What I would say is that I was raised in a family that was very equal in its perspective of gender. So I think being raised in that environment, my father was relatively progressive. My mother had a career, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the US when that wasn't always the case. And in fact, she hid having a career from her neighbors because it wasn't socially acceptable for kind of a middle-class woman to have a job in that generation. There must have been something wrong with the husband or something wrong with her if she was leaving the home. And I learned that later in life. I was raised in a family where my mother was working. She did have a professional job. My father was quite supportive of it. So I was kind of naive, which was super helpful because I went into the world thinking, of course, I can do whatever I want. And particularly for me, for my generation and in the US, gender issues don't really start showing up until about mid-career because there's around 50-50 women going to college, 50-50 kind of going into these companies. But it's as you start going up the ladder that it starts breaking down and there's fewer and fewer women in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in many of these companies. And so I think my consciousness around this being a problem happened mid to late 20s. I'd say that generally I'm quite resilient. There's moments, I had a few dark moments along the way, But for the most part, I focused on the work. And part of that was conscious, but part of it was quite unconscious. Just get on with what you need to do. And I think, I'm not saying that's the right answer, but I think that helped me in terms of just my personal resiliency and to not get myself too caught up in some of these dynamics. And of course, was quite fortunate. I had a number of men that I worked for throughout my career that saw talent in me, that supported me and gave me opportunities that plenty of other women who were just as talented as I was, if not more so, didn't get those opportunities. So I do think there's a certain amount of luck in life as well that, what are the cards that you've been dealt? And I was dealt some good cards in terms of some of the men in my life, my father, the people that I worked for, a husband who's very supportive, that gave me the environment and enough to keep me going for those moments that were a bit challenging through that time.
That's very interesting and very relatable, I would say, from this end of the world as well. Especially your point about keeping the head on the work, keeping your head in the work, and then making sure that you don't get too distracted by your environment. But I'm kind of wondering, if you had this particular podcast will be shared with a lot of young women, and I'm sure one of their questions would be, what kind of advice do you have for them if they want to follow in a similar career path as you have? Knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?
Even places where I made mistakes, I learned from them. So it's hard to kind of say I would do things differently because even when things don't go quite the right way, those are all growth moments, right? And so I don't think of redoing things. What I would say about kind of words of advice, these things are deeply personal, and everyone's got to find their own truth and their own path. So the choices I made and what I did may not work for everybody. But a few things I would keep in mind, which we've touched on briefly, is focusing on the work. One, there's personal satisfaction and doing a job well, achieving personal excellence. And if you focus on keeping score of yourself versus others keeping score, playing your own game, I mean, that's language that I've used before. On what terms are you going to judge yourself, your career, your contribution to your home, to your workplace, and have clarity in terms of what that means for you, what success means to you, what will make you feel good at the end of the day, what will make you feel good at the end of your life as you look back, and being true to those things. And I think people who are more true to their own passion, true to their own drive and their own definition of what good looks like and what success looks like, I think can be more authentic people, more authentic leaders. And I think that can be quite powerful in this world and can be a point of differentiation. If you're trying to play someone else's game, if you're trying to do it in the way that you think others think you should do it, or what you think the organization wants you to do, if you start working in that world, that is quite difficult to thrive in. And finding where you thrive personally, given who you are, what you have to offer the world, and thriving on your own terms, I think is really important, because you can find a great person who is absolutely fabulous, but if in the wrong environment, they won't thrive. And you need to judge that. And that can be tough. That can be very uncomfortable to look at your world and say, you know what, actually, I don't think this is the place where I'm going to thrive. I have to take a change and make a change. And those changes cause risk, they cause discomfort, but those could be the breakout moments in your life when you make those choices. For me, it was very clear that I wanted to be in energy. I wanted to be working in energy in the context of economic development, prosperity, affordability, environment. That was my sense of personal purpose and mission. I wanted to do this because it mattered. I didn't want to do it because I wanted to be CFO of Shell. Becoming CFO of Shell was like a huge bonus. I was really interested in the role that energy played in society and how do we have companies contribute positively to the world. Those were the things that excited me. And of course, I wanted to do my job really well. So I worked my butt off, but I was driven by the mission and the purpose of what I was involved in. And that led me to take choices and jobs that weren't always the sexiest jobs. They weren't always jobs that everyone else was going after. I went to Panama at one point in my career to work on power in Central America. At the time, Brazil was the cool place. Everyone was going to Brazil. And people were like, why are you going to Panama? Like, who goes to Panama? But in terms of like a career move, that was deemed not a great career move. But what I saw in Panama was an emerging market that people weren't overly engaged in. And that was an opportunity for me to have a lot of scope in the role that I was going to have and have a lot more potential of impact versus doing what everyone else was doing and kind of going along with the pack. And that separation from the pack on your own terms, I think can be more personally satisfying because you're making the choice based on your own criteria. And I thrived in that environment.
Now you make me feel like going to Panama to see what's happening there.
Wow, this is a pretty cool place. We're looking forward to going back.
I was wondering, now you're on the board of some very powerful companies. And as you've mentioned, women fall off the ladder, as they go up the ladder. And I'm wondering whether you see opportunities to kind of make the ladder easier for women. Is there more appetite for change at the corporate level to make it easier for women to go up the ladder? Like, are there new trends that give us hope in terms of gender diversity in executive team in large corporates, or are things kind of the same as they were 10 years ago?
I am a optimistic person, and I'm a person who chooses hope. Yeah, so that's like, if nothing else, choose hope. And that's what I choose. And I think we are making progress. I think it's too slow across all fronts, whether it's gender, race, particularly in the US. Across the spectrum, I think the world is a better place if we're tapping into the full talent available rather than just select groups of talent. And it's just a factual statement. And then there's the richness of the diversity of experience, et cetera, that contributes, I think, to, healthy, more dynamic and more competitive companies. I genuinely believe that. I think there's huge room still for companies to do more. I think with each generation, it gets better. I think there is more understanding, more belief, more programs in place to help advance more inclusive leadership. And if you look at like the statistics of a Shell, and you can see, year on year improvements. So I think when I joined the company, maybe 12 or 13% of women were in leadership positions. Now I think it's close to 30, so progress has been made. But I think we just have to go out, keep going after it. And I think diversity it brings diversity. So most of the teams that I was on in Shell, when I become part of the leadership team, I left it more diverse. And it wasn't because that was in itself an objective, but my sense of what was talent and where I would look for talent was inherently wider than I think a lot of my peers were, because my own life experience made me more open to different people with different life experiences. So that's where I think there is a ripple effect, if you will, that happens as you bring in more diverse leadership. It then creates the capacity to bring even more diverse leadership in. And we need to keep just pushing that. I will say, though, there are still strong cultural norms all around the world, including the US. And I think we're still not there in terms of how people think about leadership and what leadership looks and feels like. I could go into a room as CFO of Shell, and pretty much no one in the room would think I was the CFO of Shell. So I went to the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I had a black dress on, and all the women serving drinks had black dresses on. People were like, can I have a martini? I'm like, no, I'm the CFO of Shell. You're what? So those mindsets, those beliefs, that feeling, that unfortunately there's still a huge amount of scope to change that whole dynamic in the world. And that affects leaders today, and that affects the next generation. I don't like to say that, but I think that's true. And we just need to keep pushing it.
Thanks for sharing this anecdote. I think it's hilarious, but as you rightly said, it has happened to all of us. I remember being in a meeting where they were waiting for the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Finance, and I was seated there, and I was also waiting for the meeting to start. So, the meeting waited for me as I was waiting for the meeting. So yeah, these encounters are quite a light bulb moment in terms of the stereotypes that people have.
Totally.
I'd like to conclude our conversation coming back to something that we started with, which was the environment. And therefore, the 60,000 micro businesses that we are supporting with INKOmoko are in this reality, the reality of the impact of climate change. And sometimes it can be a little bit daunting, like it feels like a very big problem that is being discussed in big boardrooms and over which we have very little agency or very little capacity to change. But I still believe that, every single one of us can play our role in this big dynamic, which is the dynamic of our generation, which is climate change. But I'm interested to hear from you, what kind of advice would you give on our entrepreneurs in terms of, can they really make a difference? You said, you always choose hope. In the context of hope, what can they do in an environment that's sometimes so daunting and over which you feel like we have very little impact?
No, fair enough. And I recognize all that you're saying and all the points that you raised, which are so important in terms of the injustice of how climate will play out, who will be affected versus those that benefited from kind of the use of carbon, if you will, over the last 100 years. And it is fundamentally an injustice. In terms of hope and what we all can do, I think we are all players in this system. We all have a role in all the choices that we make every day. And in your business context, potentially you have the opportunity to have an impact as well in terms of choices that you're making in the way that you run your business and the impact that it can have. And again, the scope of choices that each of us have will vary by person, and the amount of influence we can have will vary by person. But I think there's an opportunity for all of us to be more conscious and more engaged in all the choices that we make, who we vote for, what we consume, and how we influence education.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very insightful. Thanks a lot, Jessica. This brings us to the end of INKOnversation. As you know, this is a podcast for INKOmoko, and we really appreciate your time and all your insights and sharing a piece of your very successful career and your personal thoughts. We really appreciate.
Thank you. It's been a complete pleasure, and I look forward to meeting you.
See you soon in Rwanda.
Yes, I hope so.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
At INKOmoko, we are dedicated to empowering entrepreneurs across Africa with the tools, resources, and knowledge they need to flourish in today's competitive business landscape. Now, we are bringing that passion to this podcast, taking you on a journey through inspiring stories from around the globe.